Name a chess player who was born in 1944, who died in 2008 at the age of 64, who peaked spectacularly in the 1970s before even more spectacularly leaving chess, and who battled improperly diagnosed and treated mental illness for the last decades of his life. If you said Bobby Fischer, you're so close. He was born in 1943. But all of the above is also true of the Slovenian grandmaster Albin Planinc. Planinc came to prominence in 1969 with an international victory in Ljubljana, a tournament in which he worked during the day and then traveled to the tournament at night, and he reached the beginning of his peak in 1973 when he shared first with Tigran Petrosian in a tournament in which he also came ahead of Boris Spassky, who had just been dethroned by Bobby Fischer and was sitting on the second spot in the world rankings. In 1975, when this game was played, he was approaching the top 10 in the world, but that was his high watermark as mental illness began to become more of a problem after that, and in the latter 70s, his ranking and results suffered tremendously. By 1979, he was playing only a few tournaments, and he soon essentially gave up chess. Grandmaster Dragoljub Minic begins the game with e4, and Planinc responds with the Ruy Lopez. He was always a sharp player, and we get here an archangel defense, which is when black strikes out with b5 and goes for activity with the bishops here. It's a very theoretical opening, and unfortunately I am not very up on the theory, but this game does have some significance in a unique line. After the bishop falls back, of course, black brings the bishop out to the fianchettoed position, and now white feels like it's time to punish black's play. It makes sense. The advance with b5 and the fianchetto with the bishop really does seem to leave the king in the center a little too long, so a move like d4 as played by white seems like the perfect recipe to punish black's play. However, with accurate play, black can hold on, but black really has to respond actively and aggressively, which creates a fascinating game. Black takes with the knight, which of course makes sense because you're opening the bishop, and after white takes, we're going to get the e5 push. In this line and lots of other lines in the Ruy Lopez, when you see an early d4, it's really all about trying to get in pawn e5 and disrupt the knight's position and get to the king before black castles. The knight steps into e4 and pawn c3. Now, capturing the pawn here is not recommended because queen f3 is really dangerous. You're threatening f7, and you're also threatening simply to take here on c3 when the pin on the knight on e4 is really unpleasant. White has a very nice attack, although the game is not over. That's why in this position it's considered quite good to play pawn d3, giving back the sacrificed pawn and hoping that if white captures the pawn, you can play knight c5. You'll be able to take away white's bishop pair, and you should be doing quite okay here as black. In any case, in this game, white played the very aggressive queen f3, choosing to leave this passed d-pawn here on d3, of course expecting to pick it up later, and in the meantime we're creating a threat of mate right here. Planinc responds with queen to e7, and now Minic plays knight to d2, lining up on the knight right now, creating an unpleasant pressure on the pinned knight and hoping that black will go for knight c5 to pull the knight back and get out of the pin by defending the bishop. At this point, white needs to play bishop to d5, and after an exchange, this rook is under attack, the rook can move, and the game is really complicated. This is going to be captured back after pawn b4, pushing the knight away, and the game is very interesting. Black is probably doing fine, but white also has chances. In any case, that's not what happened, because in this position, Planinc really demonstrates the brilliant ideas that he's going to be playing for in this game. He plays castles queenside, which, given that the coming play is forced, is already a brilliant move that intends to sacrifice a piece right away and ultimately the queen. White does go ahead and capture the loose knight on e4, and black plays queen takes e5. So this obviously is piling up on the pinned piece here, hoping to just win it back when black would be up multiple pawns and would be doing great. Of course, white steps over and defends the knight, and black plays pawn to f5, putting more pressure on the pinned piece. This is a good moment to pause your video and figure out how white can actually get out of this. There's actually only one good move for white, but it does provide white with objectively an advantage, and it puts black under pressure. That's the move queen to g3 right here. I've seen this called a lifeline tactic in the book Pump Up Your Rating by international master, maybe grandmaster now, Axel Smith. The idea is that you move an attacked piece to counterattack another piece, and if the opponent captures, you're able to pull back that attacked piece on e4. So you're dealing with a situation where, in most cases, two pieces are under attack. In this case, one piece is under attack and there's a pin, and by counterattacking an undefended piece, you're able to save both pieces. Nice tactic. The lifeline tactic comes up more than you'd think, so it's really something worth being familiar with. In any case, we get queen e8 here. The knight on e4 is still pinned, but now the point of emphasis is the pin on e1, not the pin to the queen that was on f3. Of course, there's an obvious tactic here, and it is played. Knight to d6 check, a discovery, and after the bishop captures, we get rook takes e8. Now, black would simply be down if they took the queen right here, when white can trade rooks with check, and whichever way you recapture, white can capture back, and white has an extra bishop. No bueno, we can't go for this, but this is not what's intended. After the rook captures on e8, the queen is left hanging on g3 as black captures back with the h rook. It's important to capture back with the h rook because if you took with the other rook, I don't want to go too far down this line because we're going to be looking at these lines in a moment. Later on, queen takes g7 would hit a loose rook on h8 and would spoil the fun. So capturing with the h rook keeps everything defended, and now the focus is on the undefended, well, defended but threatened queen on g3 and the undefended back rank here on e1. It's not easy to defend both of these threats. There are two ideas. In the game, bishop f4 is played, which we'll look at in a moment, but I want to look at f4 here. This is actually the better move, and Minic points this out in his excellent annotations in Informant. After f4, black can get some material back, bishop c5 check, and then rook to e2 piling up on g2. The thing is, the excellent move bishop d1 forces black to go take on g2, and after white gives back the queen, in this position, white is actually holding back the d-pawn, and although black has 3 pawns for the piece, you have to favor the 2 bishops and the extra minor piece that white has. I'm not sure how big white's advantage is, but there is some advantage for white in this position, and this was definitely the line that white should have gone for. Instead, bishop f4 is played, which uncovers the rook's defense of e1. Now we require some more brilliant moves from black. The first brilliant move is d2. Because the bishop on f4 is pinned, you cannot take the loose pawn on d2. And of course, in this position, black is threatening rook e1 simply with checkmate. You'll trade rooks, and when I recapture and make a queen or a rook, I win. So there are a couple of ways you can try to defend. In the game, rook f1 is played, which we will look at, but king f1 is also possible. After king f1, strong is rook e4, attacking this bishop, and then after bishop takes d6, you do not recapture. Instead, you pile up and threaten mate down here. At this point, white needs to play f3 to add the queen's defense to this square, and then after rook e1, rook takes and a bunch of captures, black captures the bishop on d6, and black has an extra pawn in this endgame. There's probably not a lot of advantage for black, but you have to favor black with the extra pawn, and maybe there are some decent winning chances. I'm not really sure how good the winning chances are. It's hard to say, but an extra pawn is an extra pawn. In the game, we get rook to f1 in this position. Black steps in with rook to e1, and now we get bishop takes on d6. So If we recapture here, then simply queen takes d6 is putting pressure on the loose pawn on d2, and that really ends things. But Planinc has no intention to recapture. Instead, he plays rook d to e8, threatening to take on f1 and bring the other rook to e1 with checkmate. Really beautiful stuff. It's good to pause here for a moment and really just count the material. At this point, black is almost up a queen here, right? We have a rook for a queen and a bishop, but still black is actually much better here. So to defend against the threat of taking on f1 and mating on e1, white tries pawn to f3. So now the queen is able to participate in the defense of the e1 square. The king also gains an escape square on f2. This is a good point to pause your video and ask how black can actually keep the attack going. At this point, it's been a few moves since we sacrificed our queen, and we would be dead lost if we didn't have another brilliant move. So we should really credit Planinc for analyzing quite far to understand his counterplay and properly evaluate everything. The correct move is bishop to d5. The idea here is, well, of course the bishop isn't really hanging because that will allow you to make a new queen, but you're generally trying to eliminate the defender of d1 so you can promote the d2 pawn, and you're also thinking about the idea of bishop c4, putting more pressure on this rook on f1. These are pretty dangerous ideas. At this point, the best response was bishop to f4, pulling back the attacked bishop and going after d2. Black's best is to play bishop c4, putting pressure on the rook on f1 and threatening to take it with checkmate. Now bishop takes c4 allows black to queen, and in his notes, Minic says that white is actually doing well after bishop d3. This is a brilliant move. It moves the attacked bishop on c4, and you can't take because then e1 hangs, and if you trade on f1, it seems like white is okay, but you have another good move. Rook takes, bishop takes, and rook e2. Because the bishop on f1 is pinned, we can invade on the second rank, and even though white has the bishop pair, we're doing okay materially. We have a rook and pawn for the bishop pair, and our rook and queen are quite dominant. In this position, for example, we're going to win a pawn on the queen side, and if white tried to go for it with bishop takes c7, well, then rook e1 comes in, and unfortunately, this is too big of a problem. If you defend it, then we can simply take your bishop on c7 that's no longer defended. So the upshot is that rook e2 actually gives black the advantage, so there was no easy way out at this point. After bishop to d5, instead of the bishop f4 line we just looked at, white tried putting the queen on f4 instead, stepping up with the queen and again attacking this d2 pawn, hoping to eliminate it and then let the material count for quite a lot. Black plays bishop c4, threatening to take on f1 with checkmate, and now white says, well, I cannot save the rook anymore. At this point, actually, white is busted, although it's not obvious yet. h4 is played so that the king at least is not getting checkmated when the rook on f1 falls. Black does capture the rook on f1, the king steps away to the only available square, and now we get an excellent move, rook to e2. I love that black at this point is just continuing to attack with the pieces at his disposal. The threat of piling up with the rooks proves to be a winning threat because of some amazing ideas. In this position, white tried bishop takes c7, which makes a lot of sense. You're moving the attacked bishop and you're eliminating a pawn. Given a moment, you could pull the bishop back and threaten all kinds of checkmates. However, there's not going to be a moment. We get rook f to f2, and the rooks pile up on this g2 pawn. Very strong. Now, I want to point out the best defensive idea. At this point, Minic said that the move bishop d1 would save the day. That isn't true, but it's only not true if black finds some brilliant ideas. This is definitely the best try. Rook takes g2 check now, and the king can run to h1 or h3. I want to look at h3 first. If king h3, the brilliant move bishop e6 totally wins. The main point is that after a move like bishop b6, when it looks like white might be winning because this threat is huge, you have the, again brilliant, rook h2 check, and after queen takes, f4 is checkmate. There was no stopping this threat. Rook h2 check and f4 after bishop e6 is simply a monstrous threat that is going to win the game for black. It's very spectacular that in this position, white has no defense. Alternatively, after king h1, pulling back to the first rank after the rook captures on g2, bishop d5 is similarly strong and has similar ideas to bishop e6 when the king was on h3. We're lining up on the f3 pawn, and after again, let's say bishop b6, trying for these dark square checkmates, we have rook h2 check, and again we have an intermediate move. We're not capturing the queen, we take right here, and now black is winning. After the king moves, we can take here. And even though white will be able to eliminate our d-pawn, we're going to win this opposite colored bishop endgame with ease. So, jumping back, after we piled up on f2, white missed this brilliant defense bishop d1 that lost because of more brilliant attacking moves, and instead white tried queen d6, and this move kind of loses without a fight. We take on g2, the king steps up. We check, the king is forced to g3. Check again, and the king is forced over here. And now we take here on h4 check, after which the king takes on f5. And now there are a lot of wins at this point, but rook h6 is played in the game. This is a very nice move. It attacks the queen, and the queen has no way to continue to defend the bishop on c7. So after the queen moves, we'll be able to capture on c7 at least. And it's very likely that we're going to have even better moves. And we will be winning with two rooks against the king facing down a beleaguered white king. Again, there are probably even better moves. For example, rook f6 and rook e2 look pretty great, but we're at least winning the bishop on c7. And the coming lines were enough to make white concede that there was nothing to be done, and white surrendered the game at this point. I'll point out real quickly that queen c5 here would lose in a few ways, but this move is one of those ways. Also, if the queen had gone to e5, you would have this skewer as well. So there's a lot of skewers of the king and queen as well to spot. I hope that you enjoyed this game. I really want to look at some more games from Planinc. He's a fantastic player. If you liked the video, please do like and subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of future videos. And also check out the playlist on best games that has over 40 incredible games from across the centuries.